Hello, everybody. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. And I'd particularly like to thank Don Crook. For those of you who were on our program last week, you might remember that I thanked two of our sponsors, Bill and Barbara Bennick, for their support of that day's Zoomcast, and mentioned that if you wish to support one of these, just to give me a call or send me an email at jfalk@dfwworld.org. And just a few hours later, Don Crook called. So Don, thank you so much for sponsoring today's program, as well as another one coming up soon. And this type of contribution, as you might imagine, is so important at this period of time. So before we get started with Ben Hubbard and Ambassador Robert Jordan, let me just mention a few housekeeping details. If you'd like to ask a question, just go to the box that's located at the bottom of your screen. I ask that you keep your questions succinct, and please don't use the chat room for your questions. If you'd like to one-up the question, you can do that, and then it'll rise up to the top, and Ambassador Jordan will know that that's a question that more within our audience would like to hear the answer to. Let me also thank customers of Interrobang. Interrobang is our locally Dallas-based independent bookstore. And if you order your books that are featured on our program, or in fact any books, Interrobang will send you, has free shipping. So to order your books, that's interrobangbooks.com. And we're so grateful for all of the new viewers that are coming to us through Interrobang. Ben Hubbard's book, MBS, was highlighted in the New York Times just a few weeks ago. And when I saw that, I called up our good friend, who happens to be our vice chairman, Ambassador Robert Jordan. Robert Jordan served with great distinction as President George W. Bush's ambassador to Saudi Arabia immediately after 9/11, and he remained in that post until 2003. Ambassador Jordan is also a diplomat in residence at Southern Methodist University, and he has a book too, called Desert Diplomat, that came out, I guess it was about 5 or 6 years ago. And I know you can order that book as well. Ambassador Jordan will be having the conversation, as I mentioned, with Ben Hubbard. Ben is with the New York Times. He's the bureau chief. In fact, he's coming to us today from Beirut. He speaks Arabic fluently, and you can imagine the type of stories that he's covered throughout his career. Jihadis, ISIS, the forever wars, and of course, particular attention to MBS in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So with that, gentlemen, I turn it over to you, and I'm looking forward to listening to your conversation.
Thank you, Jim, and Ben, many thanks for joining us today. I have read your book, MBS, The Rise to Power of Mohammed bin Salman, and found it absolutely fascinating. Not just for the content, really, but also for how it's written. It's compelling. Your access to sources was really extraordinary. And so I think first I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about what caused you to write the book in the first place.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. Nice to be here. I'd like to welcome everybody and also put in a plug for the local independent bookstores. We understand a lot of these bookstores are going through a hard time. So if there's any way to help keep their business going, by my book or any other books, that would be appreciated. My first idea was actually not to do a book about MBS. I started covering Saudi Arabia soon after joining the New York Times in 2013. I was living in Beirut and was reporting on the Middle East, and started traveling to Saudi Arabia. And as I did with many countries that I was starting to write about, I sort of went and tried to make myself a book list to read up and sort of get caught up on the country. And I was a bit surprised by how few good books I could find about Saudi society. You can find books about Saudi history and about, other things sort of about, Saudi and the oil industry, things like that. But I found it quite hard to find books that looked at contemporary Saudi society, what it was like to live in Saudi society, in Saudi Arabia, what the country was like, what the people were like. And so my original idea, I started sort of thinking about that. And then in 2016, I got a 5-year multi-entry visa to Saudi Arabia, and I sort of thought this was going to be my opportunity. I was going to have the ability to go and come from Saudi Arabia quite freely, and which, access for journalists in Saudi Arabia has often been quite complicated. And so I figured, okay, for the next 5 years, I'm going to be able to go and come and spend a lot of time there. Let me sort of figure out which kind of people I would like to get to know there, and sort of follow them over time and see how life progresses. And so I started talking to some people about this book, and there was, I would say, mild interest in it. People sort of said, well, I don't know. And it was about at that time that MBS had really started coming onto the scene as not only a force in Saudi Arabia, but really a rare force in the Middle East. I mean, it's really been a long time since we've seen this kind of a leader sort of come out of nowhere and try to do so many different things in so many different places. And so would have been about a year after that, it would have been late 2017 that just through a number of conversations, I sort of realized, like, yeah, MBS is the story. I mean, this is the new big thing that's happening in Saudi Arabia and across the Middle East. And, people are hugely fascinated by this person. Who is he? What is he trying to do? What motivates him? Where did he come from? And so it also overlapped a lot with what I was doing for the newspaper. And so I sort of had my newspaper reporting and then tried to spend as much of my extra time as I could trying to answer some of the other questions that we were never quite able to get to in the newspaper, particularly about his upbringing and who he was kind of before 2015 when he showed up on the scene. And that's kind of how it came to the book.
Well, you and I have talked a number of times over the years about
Sure.
Saudi matters, but we really haven't gone much into his background. Share with us, if you would, his early upbringing and how you think that perhaps impacted who he is today.
Yeah, it was actually sort of one of the more interesting questions for me when I started working on this, because I realized how little information there was about him in the public domain. And if you think about, just to sort of make an analogy with the United States, if you had a young, even a mayor of a major city who was 29 years old, or, much less somebody who was sort of on the national level, if you had a presidential candidate or, a governor, even a member of Congress who was 29 years old and sort of come up and started making these kinds of huge, huge decisions, there would be a scramble by journalists, by reporters, by everybody to try to figure out, who is this person? Where did this person come from? What's their background? You would have people probably go back to their hometown, interview people that they grew up with, go to their high school, maybe go to their university, try to find, the first employer that they had to tell us, like, who is this person? Where do they come from? How do they make their decisions? What kind of education they have? And, MBS in many ways was much more powerful than any of those people. I mean, he would soon become the effective ruler of Saudi Arabia, who was, getting his country involved in a new war in Yemen, changing policy that basically impacted the whole region. And there was very little information about who he was. So it sort of became a pet project of mine to try to answer some of those questions. And it took a lot of work. I really had to sort of track down people who had been close enough to him to have real personal memories, but who also felt comfortable speaking. So it was, I had to sort of give people assurances that I would not, identify them in certain ways in a lot of cases. And it was quite interesting. One of the big questions, so MBS is the sixth of his father's sons. The King Salman had a first wife. He had 5 sons with that wife. And then one of his other wives is MBS's mother. And if you look at the first 5 sons, they're all quite impressive. One of them was the first Arab and the first Muslim astronaut. Another one has a PhD from Oxford. He's been the governor of Medina, one of the holy cities in Islam, for many, many years. These are princes who have lived abroad, who speak fluent foreign languages, one of them founded an investment company, another one had run a major media company in the kingdom. So these are, quite major people with pretty serious resumes, and MBS doesn't really have any of that. What we know about his background, his upbringing was profoundly Saudi. He never spent significant time abroad. He never studied at a foreign university. He never even really learned to speak a foreign language well until sometime in his 30s. I think he understood English, but even into his 30s, he avoided speaking it in public. And even in meetings with American officials, he would usually, at least at the beginning, speak in Arabic and then rely on a translator. But what he did have was an incredibly close relationship with his father. So King Salman was a very important figure in the royal family, because for about 5 decades, he was the governor of Riyadh, which is the capital of Saudi Arabia. And so he was in charge of the capital city and of the surrounding area. There he is. And, this gave him a number of roles. So he was he was sort of seen as an internal disciplinarian in the family. So whenever young princes or princesses would get in trouble, it was King Salman who would punish them. and sort of keep people in line. So he was known for that. He was known for just keeping relationships with the big tribes in the area, with the religious figures in the area, with the big families, the business families, and knowing a lot about the royal family. And so that's really MBS's most important relationship. He formed a very strong bond with his father and basically shadowed him. And that is, in my estimation, the most significant thing in his education. You know, he got a law degree from a university in Riyadh. I don't think that probably had a huge effect, but I think it was the amount of time that he spent around his father, shadowing his father while his father was running the capital, that really gave him kind of a map of modern Saudi Arabia to see who the business, you know, what was the business community, what were the different royals up to, the different branches of the royal family, different sort of clerics and people in the religious establishment, what were their positions on various issues. And I think that really gave him a lot of the background about how the kingdom was laid out that allowed him to do some of the things that he would do later on.
Well, and of course, with his father being governor of Riyadh, and as you put it, sort of a sheriff of the royal family, he had access to dossiers on many, many members of the royal family and the business elites.
Right. Yeah, and this we would see, we can get to this later, but I think a lot of that knowledge, we would see at the end of 2017, we had this famous incident of the lockup at the Ritz-Carlton, where over a number of days, there's Ritz-Carlton, over a number of days, the secret police and officials from the royal court summoned somewhere around 400 men, and they were not just any Saudis, but some of the most powerful and wealthy people in the kingdom. They included a number of princes, a number of MBS's royal cousins, including a number who had attended his wedding. Al-Walid bin Talal is probably the best known figure, who is sort of known as the Saudi Warren Buffett, that's most famous Saudi investor. A number of other sort of big business people in Saudi Arabia who would, run businesses that had done, really kind of played large roles in the Saudi economy. They were all summoned either to see MBS or to see the king. When they arrived, they were relieved of their cell phones, of their other personal effects, and checked into rooms in the Riyadh Ritz-Carlton, which is generally a very fancy 5-star hotel. In this case, it was much more like a prison. They were put in rooms, told not to shut their doors. There were guards in the hallways, and they were kept, some of them for, I think it was about 2.5 to 3 months by the time it wound down. And you had officials from the royal court who would come and quote unquote negotiate with them. These were people who the government said had been involved in corruption, and the government wanted to sort of take back what they considered ill-gotten gains. And it was just kind of one of these crazy incidents where we, for us working at the New York Times, and I think many other, certainly diplomats and people, were just trying to figure out what the heck was going on. I mean, it's not every day that you have a member of some royal family lock up, a few hundred people in a luxury hotel and try to take their money away.
So this actually feeds into another question about MBS's background. When he was a young man and his father was still governor of Riyadh, he was exposed to some of the most lavish exercises of wealth in the world. He was surrounded by princes and business people who were living on yachts, buying fabulous chateaus around the world. And he didn't really share in much of that with his father at that time. Did he seem to remember that and remember what he considered perhaps to be the corruption of many of those high-living princes and business people?
Yeah, there's very much a sense. I think it's easy for outsiders to look at the Saudi royal family and just assume that all princes are hugely wealthy, and many of them are sort of much more wealthy than I think a lot of us. But inside the family, there are definitely wide gradations. There are some people who are very wealthy, who have been involved in various kinds of business and other things, and in some cases have been involved in large-scale corruption with the Saudi government, and other branches of the family that are just not as interested in that or haven't been as successful with it. And Salman, even though he was prominent in the family because of his position in Riyadh, was never seen as being particularly wealthy. He was not somebody who was involved in business the way that a lot of other princes were. He didn't run, at least for most of his career, he didn't run a ministry. Which would have been where, like a government ministry, which would have been where a lot of the corruption was, getting involved in government contracts and things like that. And so MBS kind of grows up watching a lot of these other princes sort of siphoning money out of various places in the Saudi government and spending it on, just spending incredibly lavishly, and sort of doesn't really have that kind of money to spend on himself. So there's very much a sense that there's kind of a comeuppance, and I think that comes out in two ways. One is the Ritz-Carlton, where I think he and his father certainly felt that it was time to bring the hammer down on people, that this kind of corruption that had, really taxed the finances of Saudi Arabia for a long time needed to end. There was just no way that the kingdom could sustain this kind of wasted money anymore. And MBS, I think also once his father became king, he felt like it was his turn. So there's a whole period in, I guess it's the summer of, soon after his father becomes king, it would have been 2015, where he basically goes on a spending spree. He takes a lavish vacation in the Maldives with a bunch of his friends where they rent out an entire island for themselves. He buys this famous yacht that costs somewhere, a little bit under $500 million. He sort of saw it floating off the coast of southern France and decided he wanted to buy it for himself. Then of course later there's the famous story of him deputizing one of his people to go and bid on this Leonardo da Vinci painting that he just decided that he wanted to have. And so, there's also a sense that once he was on top, it was time for him to be able to spend the way that a lot of these other people had.
And so let's focus on this 2015 time period when King Abdullah passes away. He had been failing and kind of losing his grip on the kingdom in his later years. Corruption appeared to be running even more rampant. And then King Salman comes in. And what happens with MBS at this point in terms of the government and the challenges they're facing?
There's this interesting transition because I would assume I was definitely one of the people in 2015 that when the name Mohammed bin Salman came up, it just didn't even register for me. And I would assume that if you got together Saudi experts in 2014 and had sort of had them game out who was on the way up, very few of them would have come up with the name Mohammed bin Salman. He just was not somebody who was seen to be a big player because he was so low in the pecking order, because he was the sixth son of his father, and because he just never really been involved. He never had a significant government position that would have sort of put him in contact with, American diplomats or ambassadors or other things like that. So he just kind of wasn't. So then all of a sudden, his father becomes king in January 2015 and very quickly begins delegating tremendous power to his son. I mean, he comes in at age 29, and at the time, we didn't even know how old he was. The Saudis were very vague about how old he was, and so there was a period, if I remember correctly, of about 9 months or a year where we weren't even sure what his age was, and then finally we were able to confirm that, yeah, he was 29 when his father became king. This involves things like his father puts him in charge of the board of Saudi Aramco, which is this is the golden goose of Saudi Arabia. This is the engine of the entire Saudi economy and all the wealth that Saudi Arabia has. And they put him, at the top of the board, which, there's nothing in his resume that would suggest that he had significant knowledge of the oil industry. He becomes the defense minister. His father had been the defense minister and he had helped his father there, but he never had any military. He certainly never, got any real military experience or anything like that. Next thing you know, he's the defense minister, and he very quickly plunges Saudi Arabia into a quite messy war in Yemen, the neighboring country to the south. They restructure the entire government and sort of put it under these two super committees, one for economic development and another for security issues. They put MBS in charge of the economic file. So he becomes in charge of sort of the entire economic restructuring of Saudi Arabia. And 2 years later would also be put in charge of the security committee. So, by the end of 2015, we just realized, this guy who then is 30 years old has really tremendous power. And there's this kind of scramble, I think, among people around the Middle East, certainly, and also in Washington, to try to figure out who is this guy, how much can we trust him? There were, American diplomats that I talked to and other US officials just saying, we were trying to figure out who is this guy and what exactly is he up to? We're not used to having a single Saudi prince come in and suddenly have this much power.
Right. And by the way, we've got a number of questions coming in, which I'm taking note of. And please remember, if you have questions, to go ahead and type them out in the Q&A bar, and we will certainly try to get to as many of them as possible. But let's go back now to the rise of MBS after his father becomes king. He is implementing trying to implement all of these new plans, but there are a couple of princes in his way, namely the crown prince and the deputy crown prince. How does he handle the traffic jam on the road to power?
Well, so the first thing his father becomes king, and he names a crown prince who is actually one of his younger half brothers, a prince named Mukrin bin Abdulaziz, who was the youngest surviving son of the founding king of Saudi Arabia. So this was, something that was seen as quite likely at the time because, the Saudi Arabia had always sort of passed rule down from the brothers in that generation. And then he names MBS as the deputy crown prince. No, I'm sorry, not at that point. Then first thing he does is he brings in, trying to make this so it's not too complicated. There's a lot of princes and a lot of, the person who becomes crown prince that I think a lot of people in the United States were quite excited about is a man named Mohammed bin Nayef. Mohammed bin Nayef he had long served as basically the security czar for Saudi Arabia. His father had been the interior minister, and then he had become the interior minister. And he was very much credited with cracking down on Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia. I mean, I know Saudi Arabia is often sort of blamed for the creation of Al-Qaeda and support for Al-Qaeda, but I think what a lot of people don't remember is that in the 2000s, Al-Qaeda actually declares war on Saudi Arabia and carries out a number of nasty attacks. I think a number of them while you were there, Ambassador.
Yeah.
And Mohammed bin Nayef was very much seen to be the architect of the campaign to get rid of the Al-Qaeda networks inside of Saudi Arabia. He works very closely with the CIA, works very closely with the American government. And in a matter of a number of years, they were able to, by various raids and tracking and, arresting some of the leaders, they really put this back in the box and stopped the attack. So this generates a lot of fondness for him inside of parts of the U.S. government, and I think inside of Saudi Arabia, people very much credited him with closing this dark chapter in the kingdom. So, at the time when he's named crown prince, which is the person next in line to the throne, there's a lot of enthusiasm. I think in the West, there's a lot of people who say this is great. Sorry, I hit my mute button. Somebody who's very serious, who's hardworking, somebody that we have a long record of successful work with inside of Saudi Arabia. This was somebody people were comfortable with, and then MBS becomes named the deputy crown prince, which is the second in line to the throne. And it becomes clear over the next number of months that MBS is kind of eating away at his cousin's portfolio. MBN was best associated with the terrorism file, and so MBS starts doing things to kind of get a foothold in the terrorism file to make it look like he's one who's sort of very active on the anti-terrorism front. And there's a number of other things. He fires a very key deputy to Mohammed bin Nayef at one point without even talking to him about it. He's gone. Just does a number of things to kind of, take away some of his power, put him in his place. And then this all culminates in the middle of 2017 when Mohammed bin Nayef is summoned. And basically some of MBS's deputies confront him and over the period of one night, basically force him to stand down as crown prince. And the world wakes up the next morning and then MBS is the crown prince of Saudi Arabia.
Well, it's really a remarkable rise. At the same time as we move into 2016 and late 2016, there is the figure of Donald Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, entering the scene. How do they enter the scene and what role do they play?
I think it's one of the, there are lots of things you can, lots of, I think, policy malfunctions that have happened during MBS's reign. But I think from the Saudi perspective, his courtship of Donald Trump is actually one of the most successful and remarkable things that he does. Again, if you could sort of go back in time and poll experts, if you could go back before the 2016 election and ask experts, what are the chances that Donald Trump is going to have a really warm relationship with Saudi Arabia, or that the crown prince of Saudi Arabia is going to consider Donald Trump a close personal friend? I think people would have said, I think that's crazy. I mean, Trump, he did have a record of saying quite nasty things about Islam and about Muslims. He had a record of even saying nasty things about Saudi Arabia. In some of the presidential debates, he had actually used it as a way to criticize Hillary Clinton. And so anyway, when Donald Trump wins the election, the Saudis are nervous. They basically, I think like many people, had been counting on a Hillary Clinton administration. And they basically realized this is incredibly important for us. Our relationship with the United States is our most important international relationship. We need a relationship with this guy. So they send this delegation to the East Coast. They go from the royal court and they meet a bunch of Donald Trump's, and it's basically a fact-finding mission. And they meet a bunch of Trump's business associates. They meet some of the Republicans, activists who had worked with him, worked with this campaign. They meet with Jared Kushner, and they basically write up a report for the royal court, sort of explaining this is the profile of this administration. And the message they send back is these people are not traditional politicians. They didn't come up through the political ranks. They are business people. They're deal makers. They're interested in the bottom line. They don't really know anything about the Middle East. What they do know about the Middle East is Israel, and that's what they really care about. And so MBS's team, they basically craft their approach to the Trump administration based on this, and it ends up being wildly successful. And if everybody remembers, that Trump's first foreign trip after the election, there's a long history of US presidents during their first trip abroad, both Republicans and Democrats, visiting incredibly close Western allies. And Donald Trump, for the first time, decides he's going to make the first trip of his presidency to Saudi Arabia. So this is very much, sort of the beginning of this relationship that I think throughout the Trump administration has helped MBS, because Donald Trump has in a lot of ways kind of served as a firewall to protect MBS in Saudi Arabia from some of the anger that's risen in other parts of the US government.
So during this period also, there is a growing concern on the part of a Saudi journalist named Jamal Khashoggi. You and I both knew Jamal.
Yes.
You, I think, much better than I did. But tell us about Jamal, and tell us how he is brought into the orbit of MBS.
So Jamal Khashoggi, obviously we would become famous worldwide because of his gruesome murder in late 2018. But what I think people don't often realize is that for many, many decades, he was seen as part of the Saudi establishment. I'm sure, certainly, Ambassador, when you were there, he was seen as part of the establishment. When I started covering Saudi Arabia in 2013, much later than when you were there, one of the first things you did as a journalist covering Saudi Arabia was get to know Jamal Khashoggi, because Saudi Arabia is a pretty opaque place. The government sometimes makes decisions without much explanation. And so he was incredibly valuable. This was somebody who served as an advisor, both informally and formally, to a number of Saudi princes. He met with kings, he traveled with kings, he knew various members of the royal family. And so he was for many, many years seen as a kind of a bridge back and forth, that I think the Saudis counted on him to explain what they were doing to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world looked to Jamal as well. I mean, it'd be very hard to find anybody who did work in Saudi Arabia, whether they were diplomats, officials, journalists, researchers, during an entire period of a number of decades, who never came across Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, everybody knew the guy, because you could call him, he would answer his phone, and he would try to explain to you what the kingdom was up to. So he would say, wow, the king just did this thing. We're trying to figure out what's, oh, let me tell you, the king is nervous about this and hopes that this will happen and whatever. And so, he edited government newspapers. He was very much seen as kind of part of the Saudi messaging environment. And this begins to change kind of soon after Mohammed bin Salman comes in. And the first break that they have is actually over Donald Trump. As I said, that when Donald Trump wins the election, Mohammed bin Salman and his team realize, we need to build a relationship with this administration, because if we don't have one, that's going to be a liability for us. Jamal Khashoggi is quite nervous, and he was not a fan of Donald Trump. He didn't like his rhetoric, some of the things that he'd said about Muslims, and he writes about him. He criticizes him on his social media accounts. He wrote a quite well-known column at the time, sort of warning Saudis and saying, we shouldn't be scared of Donald Trump, but we need to prepare for him. We need to be ready, because he could say things about us that we don't like. He could interact with us in ways that we're not used to. Jamal spoke at a think tank event in Washington, where he also raised some criticisms of Donald Trump, and very quickly got a call from one of MBS's deputies telling him basically that he was done, that he had to be quiet. He was no longer, he could not publish anywhere. He could not speak to any media. And they basically just shut him up, told him to be totally quiet. And so there's a period of somewhere around 9 months to a year where Jamal just kind of disappeared. And during that time, sort of got warnings that if he stuck around inside Saudi Arabia, he could end up being banned from travel or.
I think we lost you there, Ben. We have a bit of a glitch, I think, in the transmission here. Let's see if it buffers and comes back.
Ambassador, let me ask you a question then, or maybe you knew Jamal Khashoggi pretty well, didn't you? Tell us a bit more about your own engagement with him.
Sure. I wouldn't say I know him pretty well. I met with him a number of times. He was, as Ben said, a great interpreter of what was going on in the kingdom during the time I was there, right after 9/11. He was a gentle soul, very soft-spoken. He was, I think, kind of a lonely figure in some ways, but very well respected, as Ben said, within the both the government and the journalistic community. He wrote a number of articles that were well received, and he was very close to the Faisal family. King Faisal, of course, was the reformer king in a way, who introduced television, radio, education of girls in the kingdom. His son, Saad al-Faisal, was the foreign minister for many years. And his other son, one of his other sons, Turki al-Faisal, was the head of Saudi intelligence in the period leading up to 9/11. So Turkey was very much involved in trying to deal with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, trying to bring him in, trying to get the Afghans to render him back to the Saudis. And so this is something that Jamal was involved in. He interviewed bin Laden in Afghanistan, tried to encourage him to stop his jihadist ways and return to a more moderate form of activity. I see we have Ben back. Ben, let's finish this up here on Jamal in a way. So terrible things happen to Jamal. In a sort of a nutshell, I know this is a complicated subject. How is it that the Saudis could have been denying that they were responsible for his murder on October 2nd?
Well, looking back, it's remarkable that they even tried. You know, there was this, you know, there was kind of a period of confusion where we didn't really know what happened. I mean, I remember I was at an event, and I sort of came out and I looked at my phone, and there were all these emails saying, "Oh, Jamal Khashoggi went into the consulate in Istanbul and didn't come out. What's going on?" And so, you know, there were a few days when we didn't really know what happened, but the Turks quite quickly became clear they had, you know, they had information. I mean, anyway, to make a long story short, the Turks had the consulate bugged, and they basically had recorded the entire thing that took place. And so, since it was intelligence information, they didn't just want to, you know, tell the whole world that they had the consulate bugged. They started leaking out details to the media, and they just really sort of put the Saudis in checkmate. I mean, every time the Saudis would deny something, the Turks would put out a new piece of information. Within, you know, 10 days, the entire plot was clear, and it all pointed directly back to the royal court. I mean, we had 15 agents of the Saudi government, a lot of them connected to the security services, some of whom had actually traveled abroad with MBS, who had flown to Istanbul a few hours before Jamal arrived on 2 private jets that were owned by the Saudi government. They had checked into hotels near the consulate. They had gone to the consulate before and disabled the security cameras. I mean, it just all became very, very clear. And so the Saudis tried various ways to sort of explain this and deny it, and you know, and then a number of weeks later had to acknowledge that yes, their agents had killed and actually dismembered Jamal Khashoggi, and you know, and they still have various ways to try to sort of, you know, the big question has always been, how high back in Saudi Arabia did this go? You know, did the decision to do this actually go all the way up to Mohammed bin Salman?
And what do you think?
Well, as far as I've been able to gather, I don't think anybody has the smoking gun. As far as I can tell, nobody has sort of a recording of MBS telling his people, go get Jamal Khashoggi. I think if somebody had that, we would have heard about it by now, given all the attention that there has been to this case, and we've never had that. The assessment, and including the, you know, there was the assessment by the CIA that was reported, you know, in various places by the New York Times and many other news organizations, and their assessment was that there's no way that something like this could have happened without MBS at least knowing about it and probably ordering it. And this is based on their understanding of how the kingdom under Mohammed bin Salman works. The idea basically being that this is not, Saudi Arabia in general is not a place where officials will take a lot of personal initiative. It's a very top-down culture. This is a place where people look up to their bosses tell them what to do. And MBS in particular he's known to be a micromanager. I mean, this is somebody who tries to be involved in everything from oil policy to financial policy to educational curricula to all sorts of things. And so the idea that, you know, some guys in the royal court could have come up with this idea that they're going to charter 2 jets, get together a team of 15 intelligence agents, fly to a foreign country, get hotel rooms, go into the consulate and do all this without even running it by their boss. I just think many people, including myself, have a very hard time believing.
So I want to get to the questions in just one very brief second, but let me ask you one final question here.
Yeah.
In the midst of all of the problems that MBS has either created or amplified, the war in Yemen, the roundup at the Ritz-Carlton, the kidnapping of the Prime Minister of Lebanon, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and you could go on. At the same time, he has introduced reforms to the kingdom. Women can now drive. The guardianship program has been eliminated. People have entertainment venues, mixed genders in many entertainment venues. How does this square with the dark side of MBS?
Well, it's very clear that MBS he saw the kingdom as it was as he was growing up, and he wanted it to be a very different place. He wanted to make dramatic changes, and this included a lot of the things you just mentioned. He didn't want it to be a place where, women were considered second-class citizens and not able to drive, and he didn't want it to be a place that the rest of the world laughed at. I mean, I think for a long time, even much of the Muslim world has considered Saudi Arabia kind of crazy for not letting women drive. He also, I think part of that same motivation was a lot of the more negative things, as you just mentioned. He didn't want Saudi Arabia to be a country that got pushed around. So he thought that the way to keep this from happening was to do a military intervention in Yemen, to intervene in sort of a crazy way in Lebanon by trying to force the prime minister to resign, in other ways. And I think that sometimes people in the West have a hard time. I think if we hear the word reform and we hear about social reform, somebody who wants to give rights to women, who wants to open up the social life, bring in entertainment and music and things like that, we assume that this person must be a Democrat. I mean, a Democrat with a small d, that they must also be interested in political reform. And it's just, in this case, it's really not the case. I mean, I do think that the social reforms that he's pushed for are legitimate. And I think that they will most likely have a very long-term effect on life in Saudi Arabia. It will, for young Saudis, the place will be very different because of these reforms. But they were happening simultaneously with a lot of this kind of crazy authoritarian stuff, with some of this, these rash decisions that you've talked about, and with just a very strict authoritarian crackdown inside the kingdom, where, it's very much the case where if you're a young Saudi and you want to go to the movies, or you want to go into, if you're a young Saudi man and you want to meet with a young Saudi woman in a coffee shop, you have a bit more freedom to do that than you would have 5 or 10 years ago. All that's true, but he's also made it very clear that, the margins for freedom of expression that were already quite minimal in Saudi Arabia have shrunk even further. There have been, numbers and numbers of critics, not even critics, but just people who have criticized specific government policies who have been arrested, put on travel bans. Some of them are on trial. Some of them are not on trial. They're just arrested somewhere and nobody knows exactly what their legal status is. So, these two things exist simultaneously. And I don't think there's a contradiction there that like a lot of people expect there to be. There are definitely other countries in the world where you have sort of a social opening at the same time as authoritarianism. I think it's sort of the model that you would see in Singapore, maybe the model you have in China. The clearest, I think, precedent is probably the United Arab Emirates next door to Saudi Arabia, where, if you want to go to a bar, you go to a bar. You want to go to the movies, you go to a movie. But if you'd like to criticize the government, you better watch out or you might go to prison. So I think that's kind of the, there are precedents for this kind of a model.
Okay, well, let's go to the questions. First one is from Abby in Dubai. Can you imagine any scenario in which MBS would not ascend to the throne? Or do you feel that his consolidation has ensured an inevitable rise to the very top?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I could certainly imagine scenarios, but they might be sort of more in the realm of science fiction or something like that. I think that I should preface it and say there's a lot, Saudi Arabia can be a murky place. A lot of times it is difficult to see below the surface and know what's going on. From where I sit and from the research that I've done and the reporting I've done, I have a hard time seeing any other part of Saudi society that could effectively mount a challenge to MBS at this point. It's not like, unlike other Arab states, whether it's Egypt or, that have sort of strong military. Saudi Arabia doesn't really have an independent military. So I think, it's not the kind of place where you would expect to see a military coup. Most of the other parts of the royal family, I think, have either been sort of marginalized to such an extent that there's not much that they can do, or they've been co-opted. MBS has found various ways to bring their branches of the family, either by giving younger members positions in the government or by arresting people. You know, there have been a lot of princes who have either been locked up or put under travel bans or had their money taken away. And if you're a prince in Saudi Arabia, it's hard to keep a significant following if you don't have any money left. So, you know, there's other possible things that could happen, but I think the most likely scenario from what we know about how power is exercised and how many of the levers he has in his hands is that when King Salman dies, I think MBS will become king quite quickly.
Okay, here's a question from Ray that I've asked myself many times. Has MBS learned anything from his mistakes, not just in the Khashoggi murder, but perhaps some of his other difficulties and failures in policy?
It sounds like you might have read the book, Ray. I don't know. This is the, it's a question that I ask at the end of the book. I mean, one of the challenges that I had, you know, it's a bit risky to write a book about somebody who's only 34 years old and who could, I mean, if he lives to be as old as his father, who's in his early 80s, if MBS becomes king and lives to be as old as his father, he'll be king into the 2060s. So, you know, the question is sort of, who am I in 2020 to sit here and sort of predict where this is going to go and how he's going to grow up and develop and change and learn from it. So anyway, but this is really the question. And, you know, Ray, you're not the only person asking this question. I think there's a lot of people in Washington, a lot of people in other, certainly European capitals, a lot of people in Arab capitals that are wondering, you know, does MBS sort of realize what the mistakes are? Does he look at the war in Yemen and say, wow, that was really like a lot of wasted money and a lot of human lives that we probably could have done differently? Does he look at the Ritz and kind of what it did for the understanding of how business is done in Saudi Arabia? Does he look at, you know, the kidnapping of Saad Hariri and how this sort of really embarrassed them in terms of their handling of foreign affairs? You know, does he look at these things and say, oh, you know, that was a bad idea. I think I'm going to try to be, or certainly Jamal Khashoggi, like, does he look at that incident and say, wow, that was a really terrible idea, and we need to make sure that, you know, things like this don't happen in the future? I don't know. There are some indications that he's tried to take a more diplomatic track. You know, there were these attacks on Aramco last year that the Saudis and the US government attributed to the Iranians that I think were quite scary for Saudi Arabia. After that, you know, they opened up back channel talks with the Iranians, not necessarily to reach peace or to restore diplomatic relations, but from everything that we know, just to bring down the temperature, just to try to find a way to keep the conflict from sort of boiling over. They've reached out to the Houthis, the rebel group that they're against in Yemen, and they've tried to, you know, sort of have talks there, not necessarily to end the war, but at least to bring down the temperature. So there are some positive, you know, there are some positive indications. But on the other side, we also have, you know, this, you know, oil war with Russia that I don't think anybody saw coming. And I think there's plenty of people who watch the oil markets who just wondered, you know, why would you get into an oil war with Russia when your economy is profoundly dependent on oil revenue, when you're not going to be able to balance your budget at $25 or $30 a barrel, and in the middle of a global pandemic when, you know, the world economy is going to be, you know, looking for much less oil than they would in normal times. So it's a great question, and we're just going to have to wait and see, and I think hope for the best.
That brings us to a question from Wendy about Putin. Can you talk about the relationship between Putin, MBS, and Trump and their respective global oil strategy?
Well, I'm not an oil specialist, so I'll try to do my best. So, I mean, I think, you know, there was after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the most, you know, one thing that has been interesting is Saudi Arabia has always had, you know, historically had a very tense relationship. They never liked the Soviet Union. They never had warm relations with Russia. It's one thing that actually changed under King Salman. King Salman took quite, you know, I don't know if it was probably not totally unprecedented, but it was the first time a Saudi monarch had actually visited Moscow in many decades. I forget exactly when the previous visit had been. And MBS, you know, had a quite warm rapport with Putin. There's a famous, you know, they met up at the G20 meeting in Argentina after Jamal Khashoggi was killed, and many of the other leaders there were sort of keeping MBS at arm's distance, and Putin comes up and gives him a high five, and there's videos of it, and, you know, they seem to sort of bond on that level. I think that was quite surprising, you know, that this later devolved into an oil war. You hear various things about what the Saudis hope to get out of this. You know, I think if you look at it on sort of the, you know, there's sort of the emotional interpretation, and then there's kind of the business interpretation. I think the emotional interpretation is he just got mad. The Saudis had been working for quite a while to try to get the Russians to agree to output cuts. They were tired of the price being so low. For the Saudis to be able to balance their budget, they need oil somewhere around $80 a barrel. And the only way that they can do that is by, you know, shortening the market so that the price goes back up. So they had been pushing the Russians for this, trying to get them to agree. The Russians were saying, no, we don't think so. And then basically MBS flips and does exactly the opposite and said, fine, if you don't want output cuts, we're going to flood the market and crash the price, which is kind of how we got where we are today. So Saudi Arabia could have some benefits from this long term. One of the theories is that they want to try to drive out of business some of the higher cost producers, you know, shale oil in the United States. Obviously, you know, many of these companies have a very hard time with $30 a barrel oil. Will Saudi Arabia be able to inherit some of that market share? Have many assets other than oil. It has huge amounts of oil. And MBS, perhaps being young and looking forward, sees that this commodity may not always be as valuable as it is today. You know, people have, so, you know, all the talk of climate change and renewable energy, things like that. If we leave this oil in the ground for 20 years, maybe it's not going to be worth as much. So I think, you know, one of the theories you hear is that it's like a fire sale. Let's sell off as much of this as we can while it's still worth something and put that into other parts of our economy. Yep. So it's very hard to know where this is going. You know, now there appears to be some sort of movement on getting agreements to bring the prices back up. But, you know, MBS himself has certainly not come out and explained, you know, what he was thinking when he decided to crash the oil price.
Let's go back to the Ritz-Carlton roundup for a second. We have a question from Sharon. Could it be that other than his dislike of corruption, could it also be that he wanted to consolidate power over other branches of the royal family by the roundup?
Yeah, I think there was an aspect of that, probably only with a few of the people who were in there. I mean, I think by that point he had pretty much, you know, cleared out the other princes who could have really sort of put up some kind of a challenge to him. Mohammed bin Nayef was already out of the picture by then, the security chief that we talked about a bit earlier. You know, there were others who had a lot of money and who had a lot of prominence who were taken out of the Ritz. Two of the most prominent would have been, there's a prince named Mitta bin Abdullah, who was one of the sons of King Abdullah, who had run the National Guard, which is basically a domestic security force for Saudi Arabia. It's sort of a domestic military whose historic job was to protect the royal family. And so, you know, he was thrown in the Ritz like all these other people and had, you know, his assets diminished and was removed from his post. And so, you know, whether he was a challenge in the first place, I think it's hard to tell. But afterwards, it would have been very hard for him without his assets and without a branch of the security forces to sort of mount any effective challenge. And the other person who really got cut down to size was Al-Walid bin Talal. This was, you know, the man who was referred to sometimes as the Warren Buffett of Saudi Arabia. You know, business interests all over the world, had invested in a lot of American companies, Twitter, and, you know, lots of different media companies. And he was put in the Ritz, and you know, it's unclear exactly how much money he was forced to hand over. But I think what is quite clear is that his ability to manage his own finances was severely restricted. And now, you know, he basically is on MBS's team and uses his wherewithal to serve the things that MBS wants to do. So I think that was one of the things that came out of the Ritz. I don't know if it was the primary goal, but it certainly was one of the effects.
I have a question here from Michael. We've talked about the wealth, the absolute wealth of so many of the upper tier of the Saudis. Can you be more specific? What is a truly wealthy Saudi in terms of US dollars as compared to what you might call a more modest member of the royal family?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me see if I can find it quickly in the book. We actually know not that much about it. The Saudis are never very transparent about finances, which is sort of one of, you know, it was one of the issues when it came time to do the privatization of Aramco. And, you know, it's never been clear how much of Aramco's money makes it to the royal family, how it's distributed. You know, because of WikiLeaks and other things, we have some ideas. Let me see if I can find this really quickly. So one of the best indications we have is from 1996, when an American diplomat visited the office that distributes the allowances. Basically, all Saudi princes get an allowance from the government for being a prince. And the amount of money that they get depends on their rank in the family. So sons of the founding king get a certain amount, their grandsons get a certain amount, princesses get another amount. And anyway, so these are the only specific numbers I've seen. In 1996, The sons and daughters of King Abdulaziz, who was the founder of Saudi Arabia, received up to $270,000. This is a monthly stipend. His grandchildren, who would include Mohammed bin Salman and sort of his generation, up to $27,000. His great-grandchildren, $13,000. The most distant relatives got $800. Princesses also got multi-million-dollar bonuses to build palaces when they got married, as well as perks for having children. The diplomat estimated that the stipends cost the state more than $2 billion per year, but that was merely a guess. And this is in, what did I say? This is in 1996. So how much the amount of these allowances has changed since 1996, I've never seen that reported. One would assume that they've gone up, at least, to compensate for inflation. So, and then on top of that, there's, being a prince inside of Saudi Arabia. I mean, you live in a country that's named after your family. So you have all kinds of prerogatives that, business people elsewhere in the world don't necessarily have. It's quite easy for these people to muscle in on different kinds of contracts, whether it's private businesses doing business with the government. A lot of princes are involved as kind of middlemen on those sorts of levels. There's been all kinds of schemes reported over the years where basically the land, princes will find a way, they'll sort of see a development project. Let's say that some provincial city in Saudi Arabia is getting ready to build an airport. And next thing you know, some prince buys up all the desert on the outskirts of the city at a sort of bargain basement price. And then, they decide to build the airport there. And who's going to sell the land for the airport? And all of a sudden the price goes through the roof. So there've been all sorts of various other schemes reported over the years that Saudi princes have used to generate money. In terms of sort of net worth, there's only a few of them who have ever sort of appeared on the Forbes list. And they tend to be people like Al-Walid, who were involved enough, I think, in the international business community, investing and things like that, and that they would actually engage with Forbes in trying to have their wealth calculated. But the kings, I don't think anybody really knows. I mean, there's sort of endless numbers of stories of the kinds of things that they've bought and the kinds of vacations that they've gone on. And, we're talking tremendous amounts of money here.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple of questions from Albert and Paul on pretty much the same subject, and that is the blockade of Qatar. We haven't talked much about that. Are there prospects for improvements in those relations? And what is MBS's influence over Saudi's role in the GCC with Qatar?
Yeah, the Qatar blockade, I mean, it's one of these surprise moves that came out of nowhere that I think surprised everybody. It certainly surprised people in the US administration. Nobody had any idea this was coming. Or at least, perhaps a few people in the Trump administration knew it was coming, but we're not quite sure about that. I haven't seen much sign that this is getting better. I mean, it looks, in 2017 when this happened, I think there was sort of some hope that this would kind of go away, or that they would find a way to get over their differences. At certain points, there have been indications that, the Qataris were trying to sort of tame some of the things they were doing that were annoying the Saudis and that were annoying the Emirates. But at this point, I don't really see, I would be very surprised if we woke up one morning and found that they had sort of papered it over and gotten back together. So I think there's a very good chance that, this is just going to become part of the layout of the region that you have. You can look at the map here, you have tiny Qatar. This is a tiny country that only has a few 100,000 citizens, and then many guest workers, most from Southeast Asia, right next to gigantic Saudi Arabia, which has about 22 million citizens. But you just don't, I haven't seen a lot of indication that this is going to go away. The Trump administration at the beginning, Donald Trump got on Twitter and sort of cheered on Saudi Arabia for going after Qatar. And I think later the administration realized that this was a headache. The United States, has strong military cooperation with both countries. And, the largest military base in the region is actually in Qatar. It's unclear if, when Trump started sort of talking about what a great thing this was, he realized how many American service people were there at the time. So I know that more recently, members of the Trump administration have been involved in talking to the Saudis and trying to figure out a way to get over this thing, but I haven't sensed real progress on that.
Yeah.
What was the next question?
Well, what's the Saudi role in the GCC as with respect to Qatar?
Well, Saudi's always been, to sort of put it bluntly, they've been the king of the GCC. I mean, the GCC is supposed to be this cooperation among the Gulf monarchies, where they sort of look out for their joint security interests and other issues in the region. But Saudi Arabia, just because of the size of its population, it's just a giant compared to everybody else. And so I think a lot of the smaller countries in the Gulf, even those that are still on good terms with Saudi Arabia, they just sort of look to Saudi Arabia as kind of this elephant that they have to work with, because there's no way that you can defy it. It just has so much more money, so many more people, such a larger military. And they haven't officially kicked Qatar out of the GCC, but this whole thing has kind of torn a hole in the whole project of the GCC. It was one of these sort of councils that was put together for cooperation among these countries, and probably never lived up to exactly the kind of cooperation that they had hoped for in the beginning. And then, doing this, sort of imposing this blockade on Qatar, I think has even weakened the prospects for that even more.
Yeah. Here's a question from Martha. You have a fascinating piece in your book about MBS locking up his own mother. How does he treat his immediate family, and how is he viewed by the majority of the extended royal family?
Yeah, the story about the mother was one of these things that it didn't puzzle me. I think it puzzled all the people that I heard it from. And this sort of comes out after MBS comes onto the scene. I talked earlier about in 2015, his father becomes king, and all of a sudden MBS starts getting these big jobs. And so, this kind of scramble inside the US government to build a personality profile, which, they do for leaders all over the world, so that American leaders can read these profiles and sort of figure out how they want to engage with different people. And they come up with this sort of baffling information that MBS appears to have, locked up his own mother somewhere and is sort of keeping her hidden from his own father. And I heard this from members of both the Trump administration and the Obama administration. And I also heard it from other members of the royal family who said, like, yeah, we don't know what happened, but she just sort of disappeared and she stopped showing up publicly. Nobody knows exactly why. I mean, I don't want to say nobody, but nobody that I was able to talk to. The US officials I talked to basically said we could never ask about it because it didn't really impact affairs of state. Why would we want to ask him something that would be super uncomfortable if it didn't really impact policy? And I think other Saudis felt like, it's not our family. Why would we go and ask about this? And so there's kind of a puzzle around that. In terms of his kind of wider relationship with the royal family, he has basically proven, I think, to be very politically adept in certain ways, and then also just willing to be Machiavellian in other ways. We'll start with the positive stuff. I mean, I think that this is something that hasn't gotten much attention, but I think politically he's been quite smart in that he has tapped a lot of younger princes from different branches of the family and brought them into his administration. So if you look at, some of the appointments to the cabinet, if you look at some of the appointments to some of the sort of positions in the provinces, governor, deputy governor, he's brought in some of the younger princes. And I think that's a way to sort of let these other branches of the family know that you're not going to be completely kicked out here. We want you to be part of this, even if the older members of the family are no longer sort of running the portfolios that they used to. On the more Machiavellian side, he's also just been willing to lock people up. I think the way that he sort of shoved Mohammed bin Nayef out of the way, I think certainly surprised a lot of people in the kingdom, definitely surprised a lot of people in the US government as well. The princes who got thrown in the Ritz, I think a lot of people just would have never thought that was possible, that somebody that young could take some of his older royal cousins and lock them up in a luxury hotel and take away their money. And there have been other princes as well who've just been locked up. There's another son of King Abdullah, Turki bin Abdullah, who served as governor of Riyadh after King Salman, who was still locked up. He was locked up in late 2017 and is still under some form of house arrest somewhere. They've never said why they're holding him. They've never actually pressed charges against him that I'm aware of. They're just holding him, probably trying to squeeze something out of his branch of the family. And so I think there's a combination of sort of smart politics in a way, and then also just this willingness to use force when he feels that he needs to get people out of the way.
Okay, we're about out of time. I've got one last question for you from Sharon, and I'll truncate it a bit. We talk about women driving, yet there are a number of women who are still locked up for having supported reforms, including the right to drive. How do you square those contradictions?
Yeah, it's true. And, Saudi Arabia, they had been so kind of dragged through the mud over the women driving issue over the years. It was something that was so easy to criticize them on. I mean, nowhere else, even in the Muslim world, does this. This was seen as something that was just kind of so far out there. And then it comes to 2018, late 2017, they make the announcement. 2018, they're supposed to actually, they're giving women the right to drive. This should have been a massive PR coup for Saudi Arabia and for Mohammed bin Salman to say, I'm the guy who finally did it. You know, King Abdullah had famously, you know, done an interview with Barbara Walters and said, yes, the women will drive someday, but he never did it before he passed away. You know, but then a few weeks before it happens, they send the police out and they arrest a bunch of the women activists who had been campaigning for this issue. And it's pretty tame campaigning when you look at it. I mean, they had, for a number of years, they had been doing these driving days where women would sort of pick a day. They would get in their cars and they would go driving, and they would take videos of themselves and post them on YouTube, post them on social media. And the idea was basically just to show other Saudis, it's not that big of a deal. Like, women can drive their cars, the sky's not going to fall. It's not that, you know. And they've done other kinds of social media activism. A number of them were frequently in touch with journalists like myself, or in touch with human rights organizations to talk about the issue. And they could just get rounded up. Some of them are still detained. Some of them were detained and are now out. Some of them are on trial. There's kind of these running trials, and we never exactly know when they're going to resolve or how they're going to resolve. The main interpretation that you hear for this that makes the most sense to me is that MBS just doesn't want anybody to get credit for this. Part of it is that he wants to be the shining star in Saudi Arabia. He wants to be the one who gets credit for giving women the right to drive. And I think there's also a sense that he doesn't want to encourage further activism. You know, if you sort of pat these women on the back and say, oh, thanks for all that work that you did, you know, bringing this issue to the fore, well, then what message does that send to other Saudis, you know, who might say, well, there's this other issue in society that really bothers me, and so I'm going to start a campaign, and I'm going to do, you know, activities, and I'm going to form a group. And so I think it's kind of those two things. It was not wanting to share the glory with some of these women, and then also wanting to send a message that this kind of activism is just not welcome in the kingdom.
Well, Ben, we've come to the end of our time, but I can't thank you enough for a terrific presentation, and I will turn it back over to Jim now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ambassador Jordan. What an interesting conversation. And Ben, once again, congratulations on your book. And let me remind all of our viewers that you can purchase today a copy of MBS by going to interabangbooks.com, and they'll mail it to you free of charge. Let me also once again thank Don Crook. Don, thank you for sponsoring today's program. And if you'd like to sponsor one of our programs, just go to our website or to send me an email at jfalk@dfwworld.org. Our next Zoomcast will be this coming Friday. We're going to be talking about honorable exit, how a few brave Americans exited Saigon. And this book is by Thurston Clark, and our good friend, also a director of the World Affairs Council, Jay Young, will be moderating that conversation. Later in the next week, we'll be having 2 Zoomcasts. And to learn about those, why don't you go to our website at dfwworld.org. Thank you all for being with us. Have a great day.